3:10 hours. A single bulb vibrates above a scarred desk in a back room off the Lager Zimmer of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. A major with sleepless eyes shuffles carbon copies that smell of ink and damp wool. He opens a stiff manila folder, stamped with a purple eagle, and finds a captured American chart War Department. Clean type, neat grid lines. He tracks a black curve rising month by month like a staircase to the clouds. His pencil hesitates at the top. 16 million. He whispers it once, as if speaking too loudly might make the number true. 16. The paper shows more than men. It shows dates, quotas, classes of service, notations he doesn't recognize. AAF, AGF, Service Forces, ASR, points. He calculates in the margins. Even discounting naval and marine personnel, the American Army headcount, taken alone, is already enough to populate a medium European nation. He checks the German manpower ledgers, withered cohorts, Volkssturm battalions, convalescents recycled to the line. Somewhere far from his desk a building rumbles, and plaster dust frecks the paper. The curve remains, placid as a ruler. The Germans were not simply shocked by a large enemy army. They were shocked by a societal machine that made army the downstream product. What looked, at the front line, like endless fresh divisions, was the arithmetic of a republic that turned its census into logistics, its civil bureau into induction valves, and its factories into kinetic throughput. Here is the quiet truth under that chart. The Americans did not conjure soldiers from a recruitment poster. They constructed a conveyor that began in county draft boards and ended in a rifle company or bomb group. A conveyor powered by timetables, standardized tests, railroads, cafeterias, inoculation lines, range schedules, payrolls, and ship manifests. And like any conveyor, its power was not how loud it boomed, but how reliably it fed. The major flips to the second page, and the unfamiliar labels resolve into a map of institutions. He sees the selective service system as a national organ. Local boards issue classifications. State headquarters monitor quotas. National headquarters adjust flows. The numbers obey a cadence, monthly targets, quarterly corrections. He doesn't need perfect translation to feel the rhythm. This is production control applied to human beings. His own staff files, by contrast, are battlefield improvisations, orders to scrape hospitals, to comb Luftwaffe ground crews for rifles, short-term patches for a system that never believed war would become a math proof. The mathematics of modern warfare at this desk is a simple ratio. Attrition rate divided by replacement rate. When the quotient is greater than 1, units wither. When less than 1, units fatten. The German formula is trapped inside the front-line units, live or die, by the men immediately on hand. The American formula extends backward. Casualties are a variable in a much larger spreadsheet that includes a replacement pool, training centers, and shipping cycles. The spreadsheet smooths shocks. It doesn't prevent catastrophe, but it makes catastrophe survivable. Hence the German feeling. We break them, the line goes quiet. And then they are back, not weeks later, but predictably later, because trains and troopships keep time in a way cavalry never did. The major writes a note. Feind führt Krieg aus der Verwaltung. The enemy wages war from his administration. Not as a sneer, as a recognition. He sketches a tiny diagram, rectangles labeled boards, arrows to induction, arrows to training, then staging, then theater. He remembers a colonel who insisted that American soldiers were soft. He studies the rectangles and decides softness does not matter when a system carries a man from paperwork to platoon with the regularity of an assembly line. Heroics can be exhausted. Systems self-correct. He rubs his plate furs, eyes. At 3:13, another page. Here the curve is broken out by category. Army ground forces, infantry, armor, artillery, sit beside Army Air Forces, beside service forces, the invisible divisions of transport, quartermaster, ordnance, engineers, medical. The major is a clever man. He sees immediately that teeth are not the whole creature. If support troops are the bloodstream, then the American body is overbuilt for endurance. Germany's army has muscle memory and scars. The American army has metabolism. What induces shock is not only the size of the American pool, but its elasticity. If the Pacific consumes more aviation techs this quarter, the classification rules nudge more inductees with high mechanical aptitude toward AAF schools. If the infantry loses NCOs, the training system spools a class faster, reassigns instructors, borrows range time. These adjustments run on paper and telephones. No grand speech required. In 1945, Berlin, paper and telephones feel like a luxury good. The Major's pencil lingers on a final data point. Demobilization plans already penciled in, as if while his city groans, the Americans are balancing the equation both directions, an on-ramp and an off-ramp. He respects that. A machine that can start and stop is not a panic contraption. It is policy made operational. The bulb flickers. He slides the chart back into its folder. The sound outside moves closer, a rail car slamming perhaps, or a distant artillery round. But the line, the calm black climb to 16 million stays with him. Not a boast. Not propaganda. Just a schedule. His last thought before the next tasker lands on his desk is not rage or despair, but envy of a nation that turned clerks into firepower. When numbers shock, it is because they reveal something we thought was mystical, was in fact mechanical. The German officer feared an American juggernaut. What he met was a republic's workflow. 5:45. A green felt tabletop in a county courthouse in Iowa. A coffee cup leaves a ring near a stack of form. 100 seconds. 3 men in shirt sleeves. Farmer, pharmacist, school principal lean over the day's docket. Outside, the sky is pink. Inside, they are about to perform the most consequential industrial act of the war without a single wrench. Classify a town. What looked like mass enlistment was really mass classification, a national decision engine that matched people to tasks at scale. The mathematics of it was bureaucratic, not romantic. How many 18-25 seconds this month? How many machinists? How many married with dependents? How many teachers? How many welders? How many with high mechanical aptitude? How many with perfect eyesight? And crucially, how many will the local cannery lose if we take these 4? The system's genius lay in reconciling 2 truths. An army needs bodies. A wartime economy needs different bodies to arm and feed them. Selection balanced both. Start with the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States built the rails for mass mobilization, local boards, state nodes, a federal headquarters. There were registrations, waves by age, classifications, 1A, 2B, 3A, etc., and deferments that were not dodges but economic planning valves. A man could be essential in a shipyard or essential in a rifle squad. The point was not to dodge service but to assign service intelligently. That intelligence was distributed thousands of boards, making millions of micro-decisions in a national framework. In engineering terms, a federated control system robust to local variance, synchronized by quotas and policy. Now note the deliberately unromantic mechanics. A board receives a monthly quota. It pulls files, sends for physicals, administers mental and aptitude tests. The Army General Classification Test becomes a sorting switchyard and feeds the induction stations. The War Department's manpower planners know, because they model it, that this month's infantry losses in the ETO will come due at training centers 6 to 8 weeks later, then at ports, then in theatre. So quotas bake in both current demand and future shock absorption. This is not a draft lottery in the naive sense. It is a supply chain with human inputs. The Germans misunderstood this on a cultural level. Their staff work was sophisticated, but mobilization carried the weight of national psychology. Americans handed that weight to process. A farm boy does not join the army. His town reassigns him via forms and timings. That distinction sounds cold. It was effective. It meant that the sum of national effort could be planned rather than willed. The mathematics of classification begins with a grid: age by skill, by physical rating, by dependency status. Overlay a second grid: theatre demand by MOS, military occupational specialty. The output is a routing table. High-aptitude men drift towards signals, aviation maintenance, artillery computation, and officer candidate schools. Strong backs and steady eyes route to rifle platoons. Cooks and drivers and welders fill the service forces, the backbone the Germans rarely saw, until a Bailey Bridge rose overnight across a river they were sure would hold a flank for a week. And because this is math, the system corrects. If shipping constraints mean fewer combat units can be sustained overseas next quarter, quotas adjust, deferred occupational pools shift, women's auxiliary services expand to free male headcount. This is the logic of a factory scheduler juggling machine hours and labor shifts. Only here the product is combat power on time. The hinge decisions are dull on paper, which is why they are so overlooked in glory literature. A guidance memo that tightens the definition of essential industry in 12 states might translate 2 months later into an extra infantry division worth of men at training camps. A policy that allocates more high AGCT inductees to the Army Air Force's yields. A deeply, season later, a rise in aircraft readiness rates and sortie reliability, buying the ground forces breathing room. These knobs and dials, turned by people with no songs written about them, are how a nation aims itself. Adversary expectation versus Reich's reality. German planners expected the American manpower story to plateau with early enthusiasm, then grind down under casualties and war weariness. Instead, casualty news fed an administrative feedback loop. Boards did not get discouraged. They revised their docketing. Hospitals did not sermonize. They processed discharges to replacement depots or limited service. Factories filled openings with women or older men or migrants from other states because the War Manpower Commission and Selective Service harmonized policy, housing, and transit to make that swap feasible. Germany learned horrifically that you cannot terrorize forms. The consequences compound. Because the classification machine roots talent, it nourishes training centers that are designed around averages they can trust. This many recruits with this reading level, this percentage with prior mechanical work, this fraction with minor medical waivers. Predictability lets you write curricula, order the right spare parts and practice rifles, sequence inoculations, staff mess halls, and plan transportation cycles. That predictability is fuel. A division raised in such an ecosystem is not just large, it is on schedule. The dehumanizing language of mobilization pools, quotas, flows, sits uncomfortably beside the lives it touched. But if you want to understand why the number 16 million landed on German desks like a meteor, do not start with posters or speeches. Start with minutes from a local board meeting, the smell of overstamped rubber, the dry scrape of folders sliding across green felt. Start with the decision engine, dawn at Fort Benning. Fog hovers at knee height over the rifle range. A line of recruits, boots due dark, waits behind stakes, painted white. At a command, bolts cycle with a metallic scissoring that seems to tear the mist. The smell is cordite and wet grass and coffee gone cold. Instructors, men with unblinking eyes and voices pitched to carry across 2 counties punch time into this morning, the way a foreman punches a shift clock. The first shot breaks at 6:11. The last inspection of the day will end just after 21:30. By lights out, thousands of rounds, hundreds of lectures, miles of marching, and a dozen small humiliations will have been transformed into something that repeats tomorrow. American boot camps were not romantic forges where boys became men. They were throughput systems. The mathematics of training is not, did he learn, but how many men reached standard this week, what percentage remediated, and how do we eliminate bottlenecks without lowering standards. The Germans experienced the output-competent NCOs appearing after bloodlettings, units rebuilt faster than rumour allowed as a kind of magic. At Benning and elsewhere, it was a Gantt chart. Break the cycle down. A recruit enters the pipeline with a classification from Chapter 2, a medical status, and an MOS target. He is inoculated, uniformed, assigned a training company, handed a schedule, weeks 1-3, fundamentals drill, hygiene, weapons familiarization, physical conditioning, basic fieldcraft. Weeks 4-8. MOS track infantry marksmanship to progressively longer ranges, machine gun and mortar teams, radio procedures, map reading, first aid, bayonet, night movement, layered on top, tests written and practical to ensure uniform absorption. Instructors meet a target, ex-graduates within Y weeks, with a washout divided by remediation rate under Z%. If the washout rises, the curriculum changes. This is not romantic, it is tuning. The mathematics of an infantry week looks like this. Range hours scheduled across bays. Ammunition allocation matched to training objectives. Number of instructors per lane, targets per recruit. Time per relay. Marching mileage per day to build feet without breaking them. Chow hall seatings per hour. Laundry cycles. Sick call triage. The point isn't to squeeze men like lemons. It's to minimize idle time, the enemy of learning and morale, and to maximize repetitions. Repetition builds reflex. Reflex saves lives. German training could be fierce and high quality, especially early in the war, but its industrialization lagged. The American system, by late 1942 and into 1943-44, was agile and interchangeable. An infantry replacement trained at Camp Wheeler could slot into a division in Italy or France without introducing wild doctrinal variants because the content was standardized. That standardization depended on reliable inputs, known reading levels, known physical metrics, which depended on the classification engine feeding the camps. This is what synergy looks like in the human domain. Consider the instructor economy. Good training demands experienced NCOs and combat veterans. The system makes two hard choices. 1. Pull high-caliber NCOs off the line to seed schools. 2. Return combat veterans not wholly fit for the front as golden instructors. The mathematics here is trade-off analysis. A sharp sergeant in a classroom might multiply himself by 100. The calculus is rarely visible to the frontline observer who only sees his platoon short one hard man. The Germans, aiming to keep every veteran at the point of contact, often starved their rear echelons of the very yeast that makes new dough rise. Then the range physics, the channel's trademark microgeometry. US marksmanship isn't just shoot until you hit. It is ballistic literacy in plain English, sight picture, breathing, trigger squeeze, bullet drop, wind call, targets at 100, 200, 300 yards, known, distance, and unknown, distance, prone, kneeling, foxhole supported. Instructors teach the error budget. Anticipate a 2-inch left drift in a certain wind, correct by this much sight adjustment. Understand that a fatigued shooter throws rounds low. This practical math turns terror into process under stress. Multiply this across millions, and you get a national competence at scale. Overlay combined. Arms familiarization. Even if a man is destined for a rifle squad, he learns to read the ground the way an artillery forward observer does, to hear the difference between a P-47 diving and a 105 battery firing, to move under friendly mortar patterns. The goal is not to make everyone a polymath. It's to reduce interface friction when systems meet in combat. The Germans often marveled at how quickly American units called and integrated fires. That fluency begins here, at dusty mock villages where trainees rehearse hand signals, while tank destroyers rumble past and a training battery throws smoke overhead on schedule. Throughput also means recovery. Injuries and illness are not statistical noise, they're predictable degraders. Camps include medical capacity and light-duty work streams, so not every twisted ankle becomes a lost week. Nutrition and inoculations are as tactical as bullets. A recruit who misses 3 days of rifle marksmanship isn't left behind. The system reinserts him into the right phase. This demands obsessive tracking rosters that behave like project plans. Finally, the hinge decision that made the pipeline relentless, the American commitment to replacement training, not just unit training. Replacements are prepared to plug into strangers' squads and perform under unfamiliar lieutenants. It is psychologically harsh. It is operationally brilliant when the strategic aim is to keep divisions in the line with minimal time out. German doctrine treasured unit identity to the point that a battered formation might be pulled far to the rear to regrow organically, noble but slow. The Americans, whose global shipping and supply allowed it, chose speed over sentiment. The shock for Germans at the front was seeing a division that was half-wrecked at the hedgerows reappear 6 weeks later, with NCOs who knew the drill, privates who could shoot straight, and a quiet competence that suggested the enemy could replace blood with calendars forever. Boot camp is not myth. It is manufacture, not of automatons, but of standardized competence. When the German officer muttered 16 million, he was not imagining 16 million heroes. He was imagining a horizon that never emptied because somewhere, right now, another relay is on the line at Benning, bolts scissoring, fog burning off, and an instructor checking his watch. 2:07, a mill in New England. Cotton bales sigh open under a knife. The floor smells of oil and hot metal. Spindles sing, threads converge, and cloth becomes yardage under lamps that never go dark. A week from this Tuesday, some of that cloth will be sewn in Pennsylvania, stitched again in New Jersey, pressed in Ohio, boxed in Indiana, and snapped onto a private's shoulders in a quartermaster depot in Georgia. Across the continent, steel being poured tonight will travel its own pilgrimage, rolled, cut, rifled, parkerized, gauged, crated, issued, fired. There is poetry in that. But the poem's meter is lead time. The miracle of an army isn't men alone. It is furnished men. The mathematics of outfitting 1,000,000 soldiers is not, can we make rifles, but, can we make rifles, web belts, boots, helmets, wool shirts, overcoats, mess kits, entrenching tools, bayonets, grenades, radios, batteries, tents, stoves, medical kits, spare barrels, cleaning rods, lubricants, packing crates, waterproof paper, and the railroad cars to carry them in matched sets at a cadence that never slips. The Germans felt the weight of American numbers most painfully when those numbers arrived complete. Begin with the bill of materials for a single soldier. Uniform ensemble. 2 sets of wool trousers and shirts, field jacket, underwear, socks, boots, leggings, cap, helmet liner and shell, web gear, belt, suspenders, cartridge pouches, canteen, cup, first aid packet, entrenching tool, small kit, toothbrush, razor, shaving soap, sewing kit, mess kit, fork divided by spoon divided by knife, identification tags, weapon, M, 1 rifle with sling and cleaning kit, later possibly an M, 1 carbine depending on role, ammunition, initial basic load plus a reserve at company and battalion trains, and that is before the soldier's slot in a squad BAR gunner, assistant gunner, adds more. Now multiply this BOM by 1 division, then multiply by the rate at which divisions rotate through catastrophe, then add spares, maintenance, replacements, losses, theft, battle damage, weather. You are now thinking in rivers, not lakes. The US solved rivers with standardization and interchangeability at a fanatical level. A soldier could break a buckle in France and replace it from a crate stocked in Liverpool, packed in New Jersey, from a purchase order placed in Washington that was written to the same spec as the factory in Street Lewis. That chain removed friction. Friction eats time. Time gets men killed. The mathematics of equipping is less about peak production headlines and more about tarked time, the interval at which a finished item emerges from a line, matched to the consumption rate at the front. If rifle barrels wear out at a predictable round count, ordnance sets a replacement schedule. If boots rot at a given march mileage in Italian mud, quartermasters alter issue cycles. If small arms ammunition expenditure spikes in bocage fighting compared to open desert maneuver, depots push more, 30 to 06 forward and adjust train sets accordingly. The beauty is in the feedback. Fronts report burn rates, depots report stock levels, factories adjust shifts. The river changes its speed to keep the surface level at the foxhole, not at the factory gate. Contrast with the German situation late war. Extraordinary weapons in too many patterns, designed for performance but punishing to sustain. American kit choices look pedestrian until you watch them work. The M1 rifle's ruggedness and clips that can be mass-stamped by the million. The two-piece M1000 943 uniform balancing warmth, durability, and manufacturability. The M1 steel helmet that does not need a craftsman at every step. Boots going through assembly lines that also made civilian shoes before the war because specs were designed to fit industry, not to bend industry to bespoke dreams. Standardization is not a religion here. It is a bridge between design and throughput. Walk the chain. Cotton becomes yarn, becomes twill, becomes jacket. Ore becomes billet, becomes receiver, becomes rifle. Rubber plantations and synthetic rubber plants become tires and soles. Chemicals become propellant and explosive charges. Copper becomes wire. Wire becomes field telephones and miles of signal lines. Then there are containers, the unsung heroes. Wooden crates sized to fit exactly X rifles with padding that is itself standardized. 50 cal ammo cans that can be opened and resealed with one gloved hand. Jerry cans. Yes, a German idea perfected in American mass production, becoming a lingua franca of fuel and water. Containers reduce loss and speed handling. Handling is often the true bottleneck in war. The hinge decisions that made this scale possible were not always technological, they were organizational. The creation of the Army Service Forces as a distinct entity, the empowerment of the Quartermaster Corps to issue detailed specs and audit vendors, the use of multiple sourcing to hedge against plant failures, and the willingness to freeze designs for long enough to let industry hit rhythm. There is nothing sexy about a memo that says, "No further improvements to the mess kit will be considered this year." But if that memo lets a half-dozen factories run flat out with fewer changeovers, it is a combat multiplier. Add the inspection regime. A rifle that fails gauging at the factory never becomes a rifle, that fails a soldier in the Ardennes. An out-of-tolerance boot nail that would cause a blister at mile 12 never makes it into a crate. Inspection is cost. Inspection is mercy. The Germans, short of time and materials, eventually shipped what they had. Americans often had the luxury earned by planning and resources to ship what they had tested. The front felt the difference as reliability, a word that doesn't win parades but wins marches. Do not forget spare parts and tools. A division moves with mobile ordnance shops, lathes, gauges, extractors, pullers, spare barrels, springs, pins, stencils, paints, solvents. The bomb for a single rifle is dwarfed by the bomb for its ongoing existence. That is why American columns, even chewed up, reappeared with functioning weapons so fast. The supply chain did not simply feed new things, it maintained old things. In practice, this means a truck with drawers labeled and inventories precise to the last spring. Germans captured these trucks and marveled at the tiny luxuries of a well-tuned system. Finally, packaging the flow into shipping units that match railcars, ships' holds, and truck beds. A crate sized to double stack in a Liberty ship means more crates per voyage. More crates per voyage means fewer voyages for the same effect. Fewer voyages means lower convoy risk per delivered division. Lower risk per division means you can promise a commander, a date, and meet it. The soldier at the far end feels this as confidence that the next hot meal, the next pair of dry socks, the next belt of ammo, the next plasma bottle will be there. Confidence is not ephemeral, it is operational. Men who trust their river will not dry up, make bolder plans and hold longer lines. Adversary expectation versus reality. German troops entering abandoned American positions, often wrote about the tidiness, not aesthetic, but architectural. Everything seemed labelled, standardized, replaceable. They mocked it as factory war. And then, under artillery rain, they watched that factory deliver. The shock was not only that the Americans had so much, it was that having so much did not collapse into confusion. The interfaces matched, the parts fit. Equipping a nation army is the art of making the right thing appear at the right place, at the right time, in the right condition, with the right label, and making that art so boringly reliable it disappears into routine. 16 million doesn't frighten the professional enemy if they are ragged and half-armed. 16 million wearing boots that fit, shouldering rifles that fire, carrying packs that do not disintegrate in the rain, guided by radios that do not fade. That is a different arithmetic. That is a society agreeing, at the level of thread pitch and crate size, to fight two at Pier 90 on the Hudson. Sodium lamps halo the mist, winches chatter, slings creak. A checker in a peacoat taps a pencil against his teeth, while a pallet of ammo cans rises out of the dark like a grey monolith. On the far side of the pier, a sergeant holds up a clipboard and yells against the metal thunder, "Hold that those are 80 1mm rounds, not rations." The dock foreman gives him a look that says we will load this ship before dawn because ships keep a schedule even when men don't. A Liberty ship's hull groans with the weight of a nation's promise as pallets swing in a stuttering pendulum from crane to hold, from hold to dunnage, from dunnage to manifest inked in thick block letters. Somewhere uptown, a clock strikes 2. Down here, time is measured in tons per hour. What looked to German observers like an inexhaustible stream of fresh divisions was, at root, the mathematics of shipping: deadweight tonnage, cubic capacity, stowage factor, turnaround time, convoy speed, and loss rate all choreographed so that the consumption curve at the front stayed below the delivery curve from the United States. The spiritual vocabulary of will and valor dissolves under a docklight. Victory arrives in cubic feet. Begin with the unit of account, not men, not rifles, but space. A division is an organism with a volume and a weight. The planners convert everything into measurement tons, 40 cubic feet, and deadweight tons, 2,240 pounds. A case of K-rations has a stowage factor. So does a 105mm shell, a jerrycan, a field range stove, a roll of barbed wire, a bulldozer, a Bailey bridge panel. The pier may throb with romance. The manifest does not. It asks, is this cargo dense or bulky? Do we pack by weight or by cube? A Liberty ship promises roughly 10,000 deadweight tons. You cannot cheat physics here. Every extra truck means fewer crates of ammunition unless you change how you load. The mathematics of convoy throughput runs on a simple line. Total cargo delivered per month equals number of ships, times average cargo per ship, times voyages per month, times survival rate. Each factor had a hinge decision behind it. The United States and Britain standardized hulls, Liberty divided by Victory classes, standardized loading plans, standardized manifests, standardized convoy speeds to the slowest ship's safely sustainable stride, and standardized escorts with sonar, radar, and air cover. That standardization was not elegance for its own sake. It was how you predict the denominator in a war that punishes guesswork. At the pier, the loading foreman works a stowage plan like a chessboard. Heavy, dense items low and central for stability. Lighter, bulky items farther outboard. High-priority cargo on top for quick discharge at the far end. Dangerous cargo segregated by code, so one unlucky spark does not turn a floating logistics plan into a crater. A bad stow turns into stevedore latency in theatre. Latency becomes a bottleneck. Bottlenecks become a division missing its 60mm mortar rounds on a Tuesday it cannot afford to fight without them. The American system learned, sometimes the hard way, that the most important ton was the one you could get off the ship first under fire. Now the time physics. The Atlantic in 1942 is a killer. The convoy equation tilts with U-boat losses and escort availability, but as escorts gain sensors and weapons, as air coverage grows, the survival rate component of the throughput formula climbs. Meanwhile, shipyards replace and add hulls faster than U-boats can subtract them. The Germans watch with fascination and dread as the derivative of American cargo delivered the slope of the curve tilts upward, even while they score tactical kills. In practical terms, a regiment pulled off the line for lack of ammo in March 1940. 3 might return fat in June because convoys begin arriving on schedule rather than as acts of weather and luck. The microgeometry of loading matters at the foxhole. Consider the K ratio, the calories per cubic foot across different ration types. K rations pack more energy per cube than fresh food, but degrade morale over time. Planners blend K with band 10 in 1 to keep the caloric pipeline dense without turning men into billygoats. That ratio, tuned at a desk, expresses itself on a hill in Italy, when a platoon that should be listless on day 11 is merely bored and still efficient enough to dig in before rain turns the slope into glue. "We ate" is a sentence with a manifest behind it. Interface engineering was the American quiet superpower, the pallet that fits the crane, that fits the hatch, that fits the hold, that fits the truck bed, that fits the depot forklift, that fits the regimental dump. This is a chain of fit, not of brand. If a German unit captured an American port, they would find warehouses where stencils actually meant something. Class of supply, destination code, priority, weight, cube, hazard classification. A corporal with a clipboard could do work a colonel elsewhere needed a staff to guess at. That is how you scale. Hinge decisions multiplied throughput. The choice to build more escort carriers to cover convoys, even when they did not win headlines. The choice to ship repair ships and mobile depots, turning far harbours into maintenance nodes rather than mere receiving docks. The choice to invest in port battalions, specialized soldiers trained to discharge cargo fast under shell and shrapnel. The choice to disseminate port construction and repair units, so that bombed quays became operational in weeks. The choice to pre-sling and pre-label so that holds could be unlashed and contents moved without conferences. Each decision was boring. Each decision made divisions move. Adversary expectation versus reality. German intelligence measured divisions on paper and thought shipping would choke the river. They expected congestion at the bottlenecks, ports, railheads, yards, because that is how systems fail. But Americans shipped port capacity itself. Cranes, piles, tugs, dredges, Bailey bridges, pontons, rail, ties, and men trained to lay both. They shipped rail cars, knocked down and reassembled in theatre, then locomotives. They did not simply feed divisions, they exported the skeleton that lets a theatre digest them. The consequences at the line are remarkable because they are invisible when they work. A corps that expects EXI train sets to arrive by D+12 can promise an attack on D+13 without lying. A division commander who trusts his next gasoline echelon will hit on Wednesday, will burn hard on Tuesday. In warfare, confidence is the permission structure for speed. Germans fighting in Normandy and the Ardennes felt American pressure grow, even when the ground and the weather should have slowed it, because a discrete line in a stowage plan months earlier ensured that chains and winches sat at the exact port at the exact hour to unload the exact bulldozers, to clear the exact road that let the exact trucks reach the exact quartermaster. Dump that kept the exact battalion from pausing to starve. The dock at pier 90 quiets near dawn. The checker closes his manifest. The ship leans a little deeper in the water, its belly full of anonymous boxes that smell of salt and oiled wood. The cranes rest like tired herons. A tug's horn is the last note before the day shift. Inside one of those boxes is a length of signal wire that will carry the voice of a frightened junior lieutenant across a hedgerow valley to an artillery fire direction center. A minute later, steel will fall exactly where it should. The lieutenant will exhale. None of them will think about cubic feet, but cubic feet thought about them. Dusk, somewhere behind the line in France, 1944. A bell rings twice at a cluster of tents stenciled RAA, Replacement and Assembly Area. Men sit on their packs, tags fluttering at their collars, the tent canvas breathing in and out with the evening wind. A captain with a graveyard voice reads names. A sergeant writes MOS codes like a bookie tracking bets. A truck idles, coughing diesel. When the names end, a small column stands and shoulders the weight they've carried since Benning or Polk, and the column starts moving. Within hours, these strangers will sleep in the footprints of dead men, and by Friday they will answer to a lieutenant who doesn't know their jokes yet. It feels cruel. It is, in the arithmetic of armies, merciful if your mercy is measured in days a battered division spends out of the line. What looked to German officers like sorcery American divisions reappearing after being chewed to sticks was a system built around a replacement pool, classification discipline, and training pipelines that made losses a lag, not a break. The mathematics here is the ratio casualties per day divided by replacements delivered per day, aggregated across echelons. Keep the quotient is less than or equal to 1 long enough, and a division holds its shape. Let it drift above 1 and the unit thins into a rumor. Doctrine first. The US Triper made a controversial choice: early replacement training, not just unit regeneration. The replacement training centers, RTCs, did not produce men of the 1st Division or men of the 90th. They produced MOS, competent soldiers with standardized skills. The theaters then operated replacement depots, repel depots, in the gallows humor of the GI, that received, sorted, staged, and issued men in response to real-time requisitions from units. This made your foxhole buddy a revolving door at times. It also meant an infantry regiment could lose 30% in a week and not dissolve into a long convalescence. The mathematics of replacement flow starts at the casualty clearing station. A tick mark on a casualty report triggers a requisition at division, which tallies losses by MOS and forwards demand to corps divided by army, which translates that into a pull from the theatre replacement pool, which replenishes itself from stateside production. The flow is not instantaneous, but it is continuous. The key: the pipeline's cross-sectional area, how many trained infantrymen of MOS 745, how many machine gunners, how many mortarmen must exceed the theatre's attrition rate after transit delays. This is planning as hydrology. Every replacement is more than a body. He is a set of skills. The RTCs are calibrated off the same test and classification spine that fed boot camps. If a theatre anticipates high mortarman losses for terrain reasons, the stateside pipeline surges that MOS. If tank losses rise, the flow of mechanics and drivers adjusts. This is why, to the German eye, the Americans looked like a monstrous organism that self-healed without fuss. Healing was built into the routing logic. The system's hinge decisions run from the strategic to the personal. Strategically, the War Department accepted psychological cost units, losing cohesion as fresh faces cycled in exchange for operational tempo. Operationally, theatre commanders used holding units to acclimate replacements. A few days of orientation on local terrain, enemy tactics, and friendly procedures, sometimes supervised by veterans, rotated back for that purpose. Tactically, seasoned NCOs made the first hour count: where to dig, where to keep your feet dry, where to stash one extra bandage, which lieutenant to shadow, which to avoid. In a good regiment, the sergeants were the interface between a system and a soul. Microgeometry of morale. When a replacement walks into a shredded platoon, the angles of welcome matter. A buddy system doubles him with a steady veteran. The veteran explains fields of fire in 3 gestures. The new man learns to trust the section's range cards like they are scripture. At night, the mortar section's pattern is drawn on a page he can read even when scared. These are not intangibles. They are design features of units that know replacements will come on a Wednesday in the rain. German expectation versus reality. German formations prized cohesion to the point that many units were rotated to rebuild organismically, preserving identity. It produced tight, proud units until the arithmetic turned. with rail engorged by Allied bombing and fuel a string of ghosts. German reinforcement was episodic. They sometimes threw undertrained boys into gutters of fire or welded ad hoc Kampfgruppen from whatever was at hand. The US did ad hoc too, but its baseline was steady enough that German rumor felt outnumbered by phantom divisions that were, in truth, the same divisions with new faces. The system had its sins. Replacements feared the Repel-Deppel's depersonalization. Commanders who failed to integrate new men paid in blood. Poorly led units treated replacements as consumables. But functioning ecosystems adapted. Officers ran short schools near the line. Chaplains and medics helped patch the psychic gap. Mail and hot food arrived on schedule when possible because comforts are not luxuries in a replacement climate. They are glue. And once a unit burned through a few weeks with its inflow stabilized, a new cohort learned the ground, learned the platoon's habits, and the identity reformed different but coherent. The physics of time turned with the pipeline. A division that knew its losses would be met within a predictable window took aggressive tasks it would have refused if it feared a long convalescence. Corps planners wrote bolder branch plans because they could model the replacement curve into their consumption of strength. The enemy sees this as nerve. It is confidence in scheduling. When Americans call a pause, it is to feed fuel and shells and men through a throat that will clear on Saturday. When Germans pause, late in the war, it is because the trough is empty until a miracle, the most quietly radical act. The US Army promoted from within the replacement flow, manufacturing NCOs and junior officers rapidly. An artillery corporal with aptitude could be in OCS and back as a lieutenant in months. A rifleman with a steady tone could be a squad leader in weeks. The system burned out the bad and kept the good, because attrition and evaluation were measured and logged. German NCO culture was deep and professional, but when bled, it had fewer structured pathways to mass replace excellence. At the Repel-Deppel, the trucks roll at last light. Dust hangs in the warm air. The men look like what they are, people between identities. By midnight, they will belong to a company whose dead they don't know. By dawn, they will hold a line that would otherwise be a gap on someone's map. The next week, that map will show the divisions still there, a contour of persistence where arithmetic beat erosion. The cruelty is real. So is the mercy of brigades that do not vanish because a system refused to let them. 3:40. A river at flood. Black water rushing cold under a moon smeared by cloud. On the near bank, shadows move with a quiet that is almost ritual. Engineer soldiers in rubberized jackets ease ponton bays into the current. Ropes go taut. A sergeant with a grease pencil mark spacing on a board lit by a hooded lamp. Somewhere upstream, a bulldozer. Coughs awake. By first grey light, a bridge with no name will exist where last night there was only problem. An infantry battalion will cross, then a regiment, then the whine and clatter of supporting arms. The enemy will call it sudden. It was scheduled. The most dangerous arithmetic Americans performed in Europe and the Pacific was the math of the tail. Engineers, medics, signalmen, truckers, ordnance, quartermaster, chemical troops, the invisible divisions. German frontline soldiers were shocked by the apparent mass of the American tooth, but it was the tail that multiplied it. What looked like magical crossings and bottomless supplies was the contribution of tens of thousands who never shot at anyone but changed every line on the map. Start with engineers, the patron saints of turning terrain into infrastructure. Bailey bridges do not assemble themselves. Causeways across tidal flats do not appear by wish. Minefields do not jump from ground because an officer says clear. The engineer regiment's bomb is a travelling hardware store. Timbers, steel panels, pins, jacks, chains, pneumatic tools, explosives, boats. Its physics is timing. Set piers, float bays, fix anchorage in currents of known speed. Rate the bridge for class of vehicle, then blend traffic control so a battalion does not shake the whole structure to scrap by crossing in a cluster. Germans often found themselves outflanked over a river they believed safe because the American engineer's clock ran faster. Medics were the other, quieter, shock. The evacuation chain aid man to company aid post to battalion aid station to regimental collecting station to clearing station to field hospital to general hospital was pre-wired. Casualties were not lost. They were routed, tagged with diagnoses like freight, given plasma at forward echelons, penicillin down the chain, surgery, rest, and often returned to duty. The mathematics of morale here is brutal and beautiful. A rifleman fights differently when he believes a hot needle and a clean scalpel and a bed exist beyond the tree line if he is hit. German enlisted men wrote again and again about the speed with which the Americans retrieved their wounded, the luxury of their medical kit, the cruelty of fighting a foe whose men did not bleed out in the mud for lack of a bottle of plasma. Signals made a modern army coherent. Wire teams who could lay a mile of line in minutes, switchboards that knitted battalion to regiment to division, radio operators with frequency discipline, code clerks with hands like pianists. A German company commander might master the art of local initiative. An American company commander mastered the art of being heard. Artillery responsiveness, one of the war's decisive differentials, depended on good circuits. Every time an American FO spoke the grid in a calm voice, and a staff sergeant in a fire direction center translated it into charges and deflections in seconds. A line crew's night work made that miracle. The quartermaster and truck companies were the bloodstream. The Red Ball Express is the headline. But the daily grind was everywhere, 2.5-ton trucks moving 50-80 miles with fuel, ammo, rations, spare parts, drivers switching seats while the engine idled because the schedule does not nap. VM shops replacing differentials by the roadside under lanterns. Traffic MPs orchestrating one-way flow along supply corridors. The mathematics of gasoline per mile per division looks like a school problem until you lay it over a muddy map and impose weather and enemy action and driver fatigue. The miracle was not that Americans had more trucks. It was that they made those trucks behave like arteries, not a random clatter of veins. Ordnance transformed broken things into usable ones. Mobile repair shops with lathes and tool sets traveling with divisions. Inspection gauges catching small tolerances before they became big failures. Salvage units pulling the cannibalizable organs from wrecks. Ammunition companies sorting, testing, and delivering in patterns that matched tactical demand, not factory intuition. A German panzer commander knew the sickening feeling of a broken track or a seized pump, with no spare within a county. An American tank commander cursed too, but often he cursed with the knowledge that an ordnance sergeant was already hunting the part with a requisition number and a map to a dump that actually existed. These invisible divisions did more than feed and fix. They also shaped battle by altering the geometry of opportunity. Engineers built roads where scouts said there was only bad ground, turning flank ideas into options on the operations map. Signal troops put a division's voice into a valley it could not see. Medics returned a percentage of sorely learned experience to the line in weeks, replenishing the most precious commodity competence faster than death could erase it. Quartermasters kept the marginal day from becoming the day the offensive died of administrative anemia. Each tail function is a multiplier on time, the one currency an army cannot print. Adversary expectation versus reality. German doctrine revered the concept of Kampfwert combat value, a fusion of material, training, cohesion, morale. They respected tail functions, but in the catastrophe of late-war logistics, the tail starved. Bridges were blown faster than they were rebuilt. Wounded men died in transit or crowded rail cars. Radios lacked batteries, trucks lacked tires. Staff intent outran staff capability, because capability is made, not ordered. So German frontline accounts often describe American suddenness. The road that was impassable yesterday bears tanks today. The river that was a moat last night is a highway this morning. The village shelled in the afternoon has medics setting up at dusk with hot coffee and clean sheets. Suddenness is not magic. It is preparedness arriving on time. Hinge decisions that empowered invisibility. The creation and growth of engineer special brigades for amphibious logistics. The investment in forward surgical teams instead of relying on rear hospitals alone. the doctrine of centralized artillery control, which only works if signal units can carry the load. The ruthless insistence on maintenance cycles that pulled vehicles for routine work even under pressure, the training of traffic control as a profession, not an MP afterthought, the importation of dozers and graders in numbers that made bad road a temporary condition. At 5:10 the bridge takes vehicles. Each truck jolts the deck, and the whole structure hums in the early light. On the far bank, infantry step off, the river at their backs now a solved problem. The engineers coil rope, police up trash, and pre-stage repair parts for the first bent pin. A medic sips coffee beside a tent with a red cross large enough to be seen from a low cloud ceiling. A signalman checks the chatter in his headset and smiles at the clean tone. No one nearby will ever know that a dozen decisions made months ago and 1,000 hands that never fired a shot tonight conspired to redraw this map square. The invisible divisions will leave no statue. Their monument is a functional morning. 11:40 p.m., swing shift, a factory floor under a roof, with skylights blacked out against some threat that will never cross this town. The air tastes metallic, overhead belts whisper. A woman in a hair-scarf leans into a rivet gun, and the panel rings like a bell. Beside her, a clipboard tallies defects with an almost parental sternness. At a break table, another woman jots a letter to a brother already somewhere, sea-grey and far. She smears her name because the whistle blows early. Outside, a bus hisses, and a driver checks watches. Children sleep across town in a house that was built for two, and now holds 3 generations and one boarder who works the graveyard. The whole city is a schedule disguised as a skyline. The 16 million soldiers, number that stunned German staff officers, was backed by tens of millions of decisions on the home front. Women entered and transformed the industrial and administrative bloodstream operating machines, inspecting, accounting, routing, coding, nursing, serving in uniform with the Women's Army Corps and other auxiliaries. What looked like America finding manpower was really America reallocating manpower by creating woman power. The mathematics is substitution. Every woman filling a production, clerical or service billet freed a man for the combat manpower pool without collapsing the economy that armed him. This is not a postcard of Rosie the Riveter. It is operations research applied to a society. Factories designed processes around human factors, fixture heights for shorter average statures, tool weights that permitted sustained output, lighting schemes to reduce eye strain on third shift, safety guards that assumed fatigue at 3. Supervisors learned to respect labor that management culture had ignored. The result was not charity, it was yield. A panel riveted to spec by a crew that laughed at the same jokes is as lethal in the sky as any sermon about masculinity. Women were also the quality system. Inspection, boring, crucial, expanded dramatically. Gauges don't care about chromosomes. They care about tolerance. A generation of inspectors learned to spot a bad heat, treat on sight, to listen to a bearing's roughness, to feel a burr under gloved fingers. Every out-of-spec part blocked at the plant was a rifle that wouldn't jam in Belgium, a landing craft ramp that wouldn't buckle in surf, a parachute whose lines would not snap like harp strings. Germans reading American production numbers sometimes sneered at quantity. The real story is reliable quantity, which is functionally quality. In offices, women became the nervous system of the war. Typists, stenographers, clerks, payroll, procurement, scheduling. The War Manpower Commission's memos did not carry themselves. The Selective Services quotas did not align by wish. Banks extended credit by rules women applied. Railroads ran timetables, women typed and filed. Hospitals admitted, discharged, and coded thousands of cases on cards written by women at desks that never cooled. Any staff officer knows the truth. The staff is the war. Women staffed the staff. In uniform, the WACs, WAVES, SPAs, Navy nurses, Army Nurse Corps, and others filled roles that the masculine imagination had long hoarded. They plotted aircraft, decrypted and typed maintained vehicles, ran switchboards, drove trucks, managed depots, filed orders. Each billet was a solved equation. A competent person here means a rifleman there. The details matter. A whack repairing a typewriter at a headquarters at 23 is enabling an orders group to finish at 23:20 instead of 0:40, which means a courier sleeps, which means a driver is sharper at dawn, which means a crash doesn't happen, which means a medical team is not diverted, which means a captain lives to write a better field order tomorrow. War's causality is a web. Competence tightens it. 22:10, somewhere in Normandy, a convoys, only road running black and wet between hedgerows. Canvas flaps snap like flags in the crosswind. Headlamps are hooded to slits. The trucks rumble in a hypnotic second gear. In the lead cab, a black driver taps the wheel with 2 fingers to stay awake. A Red Bull disc painted on his bumper like a dare. He hasn't seen his own headlights full on in a month. In the mirror, a trail of trucks bends like a spine over the next rise. A military policeman at a checkpoint checks his watch, flips his baton, and waves the train through. The night swallows everything but the forward hum. On the far end of this black ribbon, a core rests its weight on tomorrow's fuel. The U.S. Army's mobilization power was constrained, then paradoxically multiplied by segregation. Policy reflected prejudice. Necessity bent policy. What looked, to German observers, like an effortlessly integrated machine was actually a utilization problem solved under fire. Under-recognized black units, especially in transportation and service roles, became the indispensable throughput that kept divisions in contact. The mathematics is uncomfortable. Operational tempo equals F combat divisions, logistics capacity. When you can't add divisions quickly, you add capacity, and much of that was driven by troops your own doctrine undervalued. Doctrine and organization. Before and into the war, the army segregated by race. Black soldiers served in separate units, often assigned to service roles. Port battalions, quartermaster truck companies, ammunition companies, labor service, engineer general service regiments. Some combat formations existed, the 92nd Infantry in Italy, the 93rd in the Pacific. Late war, the 760. 1st Tank Battalion, rifle platoons hastily organized from black volunteers to fill infantry gaps in Europe. But the bulk of black manpower was rooted to the tail. The mathematics of the Red Bull night. A field army consumes fuel, ammo, rations, spares at rates measured in tons per day. The Red Bull Express, a priority trucking pipeline, had to hit daily tonnage targets or everything upstream. Convoys, ports, depots, and downstream, attack schedules, broke rhythm. Black drivers often composed the majority of these truck companies. If each 2.5-ton truck hauls a net of to 2 tons per trip over an 8,200-mile route, you solve for the required truck turns per 24 hours given road capacity, maintenance rates, and driver endurance. The bottleneck was never only trucks. It was trained drivers who could keep time on a road that punished fatigue and error. The army had them. It had them because it had black soldiers the system initially imagined as replaceable. They weren't. They were irreplaceable. Hinge decisions under pressure. In late 1944 and early 1945, casualties among rifle companies in Europe outran the white replacement pool. Commanders opened volunteer calls among black service troops for infantry duty and created provisional platoons trained quickly, attached to white companies. Prejudice didn't evaporate, but it found itself outvoted by arithmetic. In armored warfare, the 761st Black Panthers proved the point from village to village. A battalion judged by performance, not skin, keeps moving the map. In transport and depots, senior leaders quietly widened scope. More skilled billets for black troops, more instruction, more responsibility, fewer excuses to keep talent locked behind a color bar when shells and gasoline were what counted. Microgeometry of utilization. Consider a single fuel company, load plan, convoy discipline, night driving, checkpoint timings, breakdown protocols, tire consumption. Put a driver in an open cab at 02, 0 inches rain and require him to hold 25, 30 miles per hour to keep the spacing that keeps the schedule that feeds the core. Make him do it again at 10, again at 18. Now make his unit a target for strafers and snipers and accidents. In such math, who is allowed to do what is not a lecture. It is a loss function. If policy excludes competence, the function explodes. Adversary expectations versus reality. German officers steeped in their own racial fantasies misread the American color line. They assumed mixed forces would be brittle, or that black troops wouldn't bear the weight of industrial war. What they met, repeatedly, were American formations whose supply arteries did not fail. At river crossings, in the Argentan Gap, on the long haul to the Rhine, the trucks kept appearing, the ammo kept being there, the bridges kept standing, the field hospitals kept being stocked. The men behind that steadiness included hundreds of thousands of black soldiers running the tail that made the tooth deadly. German diaries record the effect as endlessness. Much of that endlessness drove trucks at night. Moral arithmetic and aftershocks. The contradiction fighting fascism with segregated ranks wasn't lost on the soldiers. Letters home, mess hall debates, promises made in train stations. The war sharpened claims to citizenship and to equality. The army's utilization pivot slow, uneven, often grudging, still proved something iron. Capability is the argument. Post-war desegregation policy did not spring from nowhere. It came pre-written in convoy logs and casualty replacements, and 1,000 nights on the Red Ball Road. The convoy rolls through a checkpoint at 2:27. Fuel sloshes, canvas snaps, the driver shifts and steadies the wheel. By noon, this fuel will be burning in tanks on a ridge. The map calls unimportant until someone dies for it. The driver will never see the ridge, but a captain up there will casually order a second bound because his logistics officer says the words, "We're good," with a confidence learned from nights like this one. Shocked enemies will call it American abundance. It is, in no small part, American utilization, and the names on those manifests deserve to be said out loud. 450. A barn outside a Normandy village. A German Feldwebel reads the 5th interrogation report of the week. A captured American private has offered polite vagueness and a geography lesson. He seems well fed, carefully trained to say nothing, then nothing again. The Feldwebel rubs his temples. The reports do not add up. Divisions reappear too quickly. Staffs talk in codes whose brevity is more intimidating than chatter. And the maps, when captured, are stale by the time they're read. The shock of American numbers was intensified by American opacity. Intelligence discipline, OPSEC, and deliberate deception made the US mobilization depth look bigger and slipperier than it already was. What looked like infinite reserves was often timely reserves wrapped in fog. The mathematics, enemy estimate of force equals direct observation times reliability plus intercepts times interpretation plus prisoner info times credibility, MISE, deception noise plus OPSEC friction. The US spent lavishly on the last term. Doctrine and practice. The US and its allies professionalized OPSEC and deception into routine. Radio nets used brevity codes, authenticators, and disciplined nets to shrink exploitable chatter. Units practiced radio silence during movements that mattered. Dummy traffic was generated to invent formations that didn't exist yet. Inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, fake shoulder patches, carefully placed rumors, and leaks seeded a plausible alternative reality in enemy channels. The deception umbrella over Normandy, and later operations, didn't conjure American strength. It steered German attention away from the real concentrations, long enough for those concentrations to become facts. The mathematics of disciplined nets. A modern field army's electromagnetic life can drown itself. Every unauthenticated call, every lazy grid, every overlong report adds exploitable entropy to the ether. The Americans, learning from British rigor and their own air-ground integration needs, taught signal discipline like gunnery. Elegant brevity married to artillery fire direction computation made observed fire feel instantaneous. It also meant German intercept teams got less of the soft intelligence they could use to fill in manpower guesses. A silent net doesn't look weak. It looks confident. Prisoners and paper. The US trained its troops to hand out nothing. Dog tags and paybooks told little. Orders were compartmented. Movements were communicated late enough that even a talkative private knew only his own mile. German interrogators were skilled, but reduced to inference and pattern matching, they saw what the Americans wanted seen. Shadows of phantom divisions where a strong deception plan aimed them, and silence where the real divisions were forming. Hinge decisions. The choice, to centralize deception planning and integrate it into operations not as a flourish, but as a precondition mattered. Staffs assigned deception tasks as seriously as ammunition forecasts. Logistics supported deception. Moving dummy kit, building fake marshalling yards, burning fuel and time on lies that protected the truth. The US also embraced air supremacy as an intelligence weapon. Aerial reconnaissance denied the enemy the kind of laydown they needed to measure American muscle accurately. If your map is always a week behind, you overestimate to be safe, handing the Americans a psychological dividend. German expectation versus reality. German staff culture prized combat reconnaissance and a keen sense of enemy style. Their style book said Americans were open, busy, mechanically competent, talkative, traceable. Then they met a version of America that was procedural and tight-lipped. The mismatch bloated German error bars. They often erred on the high side, imagining reserves the Americans didn't yet have or mislocated the reserves the Americans actually had. The felt experience at the front, fresh battalions at dusk, new batteries by dawn confirmed their bias. What they didn't see was that much of the shock came from the timing of a merely sufficient reserve, delivered exactly when a brittle point was probed. Microgeometry of deception, a dummy radio net whispering at exactly the correct signal strength, a fake traffic pattern at a marshalling area that produces tire tracks where reconnaissance cameras will find them, a bogus order lost in a way that flatters the enemy's tradecraft, a patch worn in a cafe by a soldier who mentions a unit that doesn't exist, a pontoon raft moored where a division has no intention of crossing. None of this wins battles by itself. All of it metabolizes into the enemy's estimates, and estimates become decisions. When decisions go wrong, the river is suddenly crossed and the ridge is suddenly flanked and the staff diary suddenly sounds like disbelief. At 5:20, the Feldwebel circles a sentence in a report and writes a note in the margin, "Americans strong everywhere." It is not true. It is true enough to paralyze. If your enemy can make you believe he is strong everywhere, he has added brigades to his order of battle without training a man. 17.5. A company CP in a damp orchard. A German lieutenant with mud on his boots scribbles a letter to his wife. He writes that the Americans are without end, that battalions we broke last week hum again, that the sky produces fresh aircraft like a storm that will not exhaust itself. He folds the paper, then tears it, then writes it again with fewer adjectives. The adjective he wants is simply more. The operational arithmetic of 16 million served became battlefield psychology. When the replacement curve outruns the attrition curve, and the supply curve outruns the consumption curve, the enemy begins to feel outnumbered even when, on a given line, he may not be. That feeling changes decisions: earlier withdrawals, shorter counterattacks, a readiness to believe rumors. The mathematics here is expectation. Will fresh American power arrive before my gamble pays? If officers answer, probably, their boldness collapses into guardedness. Doctrinal effect. American commanders, trusting their logistics and replacements, planned with branch and sequel confidence. If the first thrust stalls, the second will open. If the bridge fails, another crossing site exists. If a regiment burns down to half strength, a battalion of fresh men is already on rails. This confidence translated into tempo. Tempo created the illusion of inexhaustibility, a force moving while you're still recalculating. German commanders, especially late, wrote of a time sickness. Decisions that once felt crisp now felt hedged because the horizon never cleared of American capability. The mathematics of rumor. In every regiment there is an informal model of the enemy. You average artillery density by day, truck traffic by night, the frequency of rotation, the quality of new faces. When all the averages between August and December curve upward for the Americans, as they did after the ports opened, and the training divided by replacement system hit steady state, you don't need a staff study to convince you that resistance is eroding faster than you can reinforce. You start seeing patterns. The platoon that should stay weary arrives fresh. The unit that should rotate back refuses. The artillery that should slow at dusk grows louder. Your brain discounts your own possibilities. That is strategic psychology. Hinge moments. Faltering counterstrokes in Normandy because commanders assumed the Americans had another division ready. Caution around the Bulge's shoulders once the Allied logistics recovered. The sudden weakness of German defenders along rivers once the rhythm of engineer crossings became familiar. They will be over by morning. That sentence robs you of time. Time is courage's favorite drug, microgeometry of fear and relief. An American platoon that has socks, hot soup and dry blankets fights at a slightly different angle the next morning. Its sergeant takes a hill he would otherwise contour around. Expand this by a corps, and those small decisions become a front that pushes when it might have paused. Germans feel their mirror image. The medics have no plasma, the boots leak, the blankets are gone, the soup is thin. The sergeant who would have held until dusk calls it at 15. Multiply by a corps, and an otherwise defensible line unlaces. Letters and diaries, the human API. German correspondents did not only cite material, they cited tempo and freshness. Always someone new in front of us, one writes. Another observes that American guns do not seem to need to sleep. An artilleryman notes that cutting their wire buys minutes, not hours. Lines are relayed by men who run, faster than his men can follow. A panzer officer describes losing the same ground twice to an infantry regiment that returned with an undented voice on the radio. The story those words tell is not of invincible giants, but of an enemy who doesn't sag where you count on sag. Adversary expectation versus reality. German training and will produced ferocious counterattacks and tactical mastery long after defeat was certain. But the expectation that the Americans would become sluggish, demoralized, or logistically disjointed failed. A force that stays predictably supplied and predictably replaced is not brave by accident. It is brave by design. The shock is that bravery can be planned. The lieutenant in the orchard folds a cleaner letter. He promises to be careful. He tells his wife that the enemy is many. He means present, day after day, with the regularity of rain in a temperate climate. That climate drowns more than it dashes. The American secret was not thunder. It was weather. 1430, September 1945, a stateside separation center. The loudest sound is paper sliding. Forms stamped, signatures squared, discharge buttons swapped for collar brass, a clerk's monotone reading entitlements like a catechism. In a corner, duffel bags slump in pairs like cattle lying down. A sergeant methodically clips dog tags onto a string and coils it like a rosary. A staff captain sharpens a pencil that will reduce the U.S. Army by thousands of men today, and then thousands tomorrow, and then thousands again, until the number 16 million belongs to memory and payroll, not to formations under orders. The final proof that America mobilized a system, not just an army, is that it could stop cleanly. Demobilization is the inverse of mobilization, routing millions through points, systems, transport schedules, medical processing, job placement, and education benefits without economic whiplash or mass mutiny. What looked to German officers like a bottomless well turned out to be a valved reservoir opened and then closed on a timetable. The mathematics of the off-ramp. Post-war personnel policy used a points system. Days served, combat service, decorations, dependents summed into a number that determined priority for discharge. This turned raw emotion, I want to go home, into cues. Queues became movement orders to ports, which became berths on ships, which became rail tickets, which became civilian jobs and classrooms. The function is outflow per month equals F, transport capacity, processing capacity, legal criteria, economic absorption. The United States tuned all four: doctrine and administration. Separation centers were the boot camp's mirror image. Medical checks, pay settlement, records audits, uniform exchange, counseling on benefits. The GI Bill transformed returning soldiers into students and homeowners rather than a restless surplus of labor. The War Department and War Shipping Administration scheduled troop ships like ore carriers, predictable, optimized, minimally idle. Units didn't just evaporate, they were reflagged, consolidated, or put into occupation duty with rotation already planned. Hinge decisions that made stopping humane. Keeping discipline on the criteria, no mass favoritism, publicly posting schedules, and communicating delays like weather reports prevented rage from metastasizing. Investing in education, benefits and mortgage guarantees turned a potential unemployment shock into a consumption boom. Maintaining a rump of trained cadre meant the off-ramp didn't erase the on-ramp's know-how. The nation resisted the temptation to freeze a giant military as a peacetime monument. Instead, it built a reserve that remembered procedures without remembering war too intimately. Microgeometry of dignity, a uniform exchange done without sneer, a pay error corrected on the spot, a discharge ceremony with a band instead of a shrug, a train platform with coffee and a timetable that runs. These details prevented a mass of men from feeling discarded by the machine they had powered. A machine is only moral if it returns parts to the world better than scrap. Adversary reflection. For Germans peering out from ruins, American demobilization was another shock. The giant didn't squat on the continent indefinitely. It reconfigured. A people capable of war as workflow showed itself capable of peace as workflow. If the mobilization graph ascending towards 16 million had felt like doom, the demobilization graph descending with equal predictability must have felt like fate's reverse proof. This was never sorcery. It was policy working. In the separation center at 16.5, a private receives his papers, and with a strange lightness, a new identity. He steps out into a parking lot where a bus idles, where a woman checks a list, where the timetable holds, where 1,000 invisible hands have prepared his off-ramp with the same quiet competence that built his on-ramp. Somewhere across an ocean, a German desk still holds a chart he once feared. If he could see this afternoon, he would understand the truth hidden in its curve. America's strength wasn't just how high the line went, it was how straight both lines up and down were drawn.